This story is about a man named Hard Luck Harry. I don't actually know the man's name, but from everything I have come to know, I suspect that his name was very probably Hard Luck Harry. I underline that I was not present when this story took place. However, the story was told to me by a man who I know was honest. In fact, the man was the most honest man I have ever known. This story is more honest than if I was telling the story having been there myself. And that includes the stuff I have had to make up to fill in the gaps for when I wasn't actually there. The truth of the original story is so strong that it has been transmitted through to the current telling. This story is that true. I wasn't there, but as told to me, this story is true. Every word is true. I'm going to tell you the story as if I were there. Since every word is true, there really is no difference. Just pretend that I am the person who told the story to me. I was driving south in a long line of mainly black cars on U.S. Federal Route 301 somewhere south of Santee, South Carolina. It was well into day 2 of the 3-day trip from Ithaca, New York to Orlando, Florida. It was hot. My Model A radiator was threatening to blow at any time. There was some kind of a pinhole leak in one of the vapor lines that caused an irregular, pulsing, high-pitched whine that would start and stop suddenly for no reason. That whine was maddening, and I was tired of waiting for it to stop and tired of waiting for it to start. The southbound lane was packed and moving at about 20 miles per hour, all of us going to Florida. The initial time is about 10 a.m. Eastern. The year is 1935. The northbound lane, opposite to us who were headed south and seeking the Florida Promised Land, was filled with an irregular flux of all kinds of cars going 40, even 50 miles an hour. They were going to all kinds of disparate places to the north, near and far, in their own good time. Unlike us, jammed into the southbound lane, they were free like birds. I was starting to wonder if some of those northern places might not be preferable to the southern paradise that we southbounders were headed for. For me, at least, it was a family thing. Still, I think all of us, stopping and starting fender to fender in the southbound lane, were starting to feel that the northbounders were laughing at us. The hot tar 2-lane highway was straight north-south for miles in both directions, with a wide downward slope of dry field grass on our left. On the right was a high, impenetrable hedge of dark green bushes and closely spaced trunks of trees of all sizes. The shoulder on the right was no more than 6 inches wide, and the wall of vegetation literally blocked out the sun. What kind of wilderness or ranch or farm or canal or what was over there on the right, I had no idea at all. It was impenetrable, and it went on for miles. So if you did have to go off the road for some reason, that would not be the place for it. The left was the way to go. I first noticed Harry in my driver's side mirror. A good quarter-mile back, a big emerald green roadster had pulled out of line of the black Model A commoners into the oncoming traffic and been blasted back into line by the air horn of a barreling delivery truck. It wasn't 10 seconds before the long green snout of the roadster peeped out for another look, and then the great vehicle yanked itself into the oncoming lane and bombed forward before being threatened back into line by oncoming horns. Even at that distance, I could feel the rising anger back in the line of cars behind me, about having to make space for the big roadster to be repeatedly let back in. At one point, our southbound line stopped for a good 12 unexplained minutes as the opposing line denizen whipped by on their unimpeded free ride to the north. But that did not stop the by now considerably closer Harry. Repeatedly, he poked his big car out into the oncoming lane, advanced past a couple of stopped regulars, and then horned his way back into the line, forcing cars aside and sparing himself a collision. The irate honking, both oncoming and residents in the southward line, underlined that this was a situation of growing intensity. And gradually, as our own line lurched forward once again, I could feel that those of us ahead of Harry, and even ahead of me, were coming to understand that Harry's discontented situation would soon wrap itself around all of our worn-out and heat-beaten shoulders. At that point, of course, I had no idea of the significance that my own worn and beat-down vehicle was going to play. 10 minutes later, Harry was on me. Only 3 cars back, I saw him in the mirror nosing out. He got blasted back a couple of times and then laid on the gas and vaulted forward. At that exact moment, a beat-up old flatbed truck zoomed northbound past my left bumper with his horn blaring. At the speed that rig was going, I thought it would be quite a job to keep it on the road at all, much less facing Harry in the oncoming lane. In any case, for whatever reason, the truck leapt the pavement and angled down the shallow grade into a flooded catchment area and ground to a halt in a spectacular flowering cloud of dust. Harry, meanwhile, had also lost control and cut a pair of sandy ribbons inside the path of the truck and down a flatter part of the field, and was bouncing along at a still alarmingly high speed toward some deep weeds and brush. It was during his initial trajectory that I noticed for the first time that Harry's big green car was in fact a convertible. The whole back half of his car was covered by a black canvas top with a fancy silver symbol painted on the side. Now I know what you may be thinking. Were there any commercially produced green convertible roadsters in that era that could have been in a long line of southbound, mainly black cars on old US 301 a little south of Santee, South Carolina? And I can't say that I know that there were. But if there weren't, then it must have been a custom job of some kind, because I recall every detail of the events of that afternoon, and I have taken the trouble to render those details exactly as they were, nothing altered. But I will say that if that question, green convertible or no green convertible in 1935, is your only problem with the following accounts of the events of that hot February day just south of Santee, South Carolina, then I am counting you, along with myself, as a believer. As the long green car bounced over the terrain, it suddenly lurched to the side with front wheels twisted, and a large woman in a white dress with red sashes exited the vehicle either through the canvas stop or to the flapping side, and having attained a substantial height and hovering there for seemingly quite some time, plummeted into a shallow cattail pond with a powerful cannonball explosion in the bright Carolina sun. Harry himself was still sitting behind the wheel as if stunned. We in the south lane stopped and stepped out onto the pavement to assess these events, and several northbound cars slowed and pulled onto the straw and rolled out to the slide. I am not ashamed to say that no southbound car contained an occupant who thought for 1 second about giving up his spot in the southbound lane to render assistance. If there were any exquisitely trained specialty medical or mechanical personnel in that line who could have rendered more efficacious assistance than a common northbound man could be thought capable of rendering, they did not so indicate. And thus, as if in a line of World War I mule-drawn cannons in the mud of the flood plain of the River Somme, when the line started moving, we all saddled up and moved on to the south. I did vaguely think about pulling off a little later if I saw some place where I thought I could get that high-pitch radiator leak patched before it caused real trouble, even though I knew I wasn't going to do that. There's something about a droning caravan of desolately creeping cars that requires a deeply held, self-enforced obedience, no matter how distant and hopeless the destination, or how little a short respite from the line would matter. But none of us would lose our place in the line except for gas or mechanical necessity. I will note that it was now about 10:30 in the morning. Around noon, having covered another 40 miles or so, the scene had not changed much. The cars in front and behind me were still the same cars. The same modest grade of dry grass and weeds stretched out to the left, and the same thick, dark jungle wall sprung up to the right mere inches from the road. Perhaps this is the time to describe in more detail the exact nature of the wilderness barrier which guarded the right side of that highway. There is an expanse down that way called the Great Dismal Swamp, though I think that's in North Carolina. That's the one to which the poet Robert Frost, despairing over this and that, including a woman, took the trouble to train down from New Hampshire to in 1894 to meet his fate, debarking into the bog with the hope that just forces would take him from us in some dark and deep sinkhole at a time and place of their own choosing. Fortunately for posterity, he was spared that fate and slogged back to the train station and went back to New Hampshire to write the famous poems over the ensuing decades which settled life's ambiguities so that we, the readers, would not have to debark on similar expeditions. The primeval boundary by the road had to be like the Great Dismal Swamp. It was a no-name swamp that was probably even darker and deeper than the Dismal itself. I don't see how it could have been any less hot driving inches from it for hours like that. I remember thinking that this was the last time I was ever making this trip, and in fact I might just turn around any time. That's when the telltale distinctive movement in the backwards distance of the side mirror again caught my eye. Oh, it was Harry, all right. I'd been thinking I had already heard some horns back in the line, but hadn't consciously put it together. It seemed impossible, yet somehow not surprising, to see Harry back there again. How could he have got his car out of its crumpled position off the highway? And what about the enormous woman in the white dress with red sashes? But there it was, the unmistakable barrel of Harry's green roadster nosing south into the northbound lane once again. The rapid retreats, the daring sprints, the close calls, the blasting horns, accompanying the forced meshing when Harry rejoined the line. It was all there, just as before. I would say, by the way, that I did not yet refer to Harry as Harry at this time. Certainly not as Hard Luck Harry. At this time, coming up on noon on that day in South Carolina, I merely noted the reapproach of the same guy as before. Well, I'll be darned. There he is again. Ain't that something? Again, there were many repetitions of the afore-described outs and ins, dodges, sprints, horns, etc. If anything, it was possible Harry had become even more desperate. On several occasions I could see in the mirror that Harry himself went off the road to the left to avoid an oncoming smash-up, letting the northbound car slip by to his inside right. How risky is that? If the northbound guy swerved right instead of left, that would be it. It just seemed a matter of time. The din of the horns was biblical. Soon Harry gained a position directly behind me and began the familiar nosing out and back in as the north cars whizzed by in his face at double or even triple his speed. Fast cars, trucks, buses. There were more of them now, since people tend to come out more later in the day, and maybe even going faster. But none of this affected Harry. Indeed, the horns seemed proportionally louder as a result of the increased speed, and certainly reflecting the fraying bonds of driver civility in the increasingly stifling heat. I braced for Harry's imminent pass and wondered if I would have to be the next man to choose between life, his and mine, and letting him back in line. Keep in mind, this was the first time I had actually seen Harry up close. He had never gotten out of the green car, whose front wheels were jammed into the weeds when last seen. And only now, as he was nosing out beside me, just as a rampaging White Star Line's passenger bus veered just enough to avoid an explosion, did I get a good look at him. The convertible canvas was now gone, as I think was part of the roof of the car's cab. Like the woman, who clearly was no longer in the back seat, Harry was huge, 300 plus, also dressed in white. A white dress shirt with rolled-up sleeves and with gigantic Popeye-like sunburned forearms and, of course, streamlined dark glasses. He was leaning out the driver's side window assessing the oncoming lane and had just started to gun past me. As I looked over at him, a fair-sized pig ran out across in front of me and slammed into Harry's right bumper, and he careened across the north lane and down a steep bank into some waist-high sedge grass and jammed to a stop. I could see Harry sitting there, holding onto the wheel and looking downward at the angle his car was slanted at. Looking back on it, I would say he seemed, even then, resigned. It happened so fast, none of us in the line even slowed down. Again, we could see northbound cars stopping, and it had been a long day, and we just kept going. Now, you might say you know where this story is going. I'm going to say you don't. And the reason for that is that nobody can predict the future, and nobody can predict the truth. Suffice it to say that about 2 o'clock that afternoon, as Harry again approached with his in and out weaving, I was even less surprised than before. I was hotter and hungrier and thirstier, but nothing else had changed much except for another 60 miles. I had spent a little time contemplating the extreme thickness of the hedge thicket to the right of the road, and wondering how it could have concealed a 400-pound pig, and what sort of farm or swamp was indeed bordered by the highway and the line of trees. I think it must have been something remarkably and extensively dark and fetid over there behind the screen of brush. It's probably all housing developments and strip malls now, but back then you couldn't see into it or over it or anything. You couldn't have gotten through it with a battle tank and explosives. And other than a few splashes of light reflected off pools of standing water visible through the cracks, there wasn't an extra inch of space between and beyond those trunks to slip a finger through. Robert Frost could not have gotten through there to put the universe's moral judgment to the test. The one thing that swamp edge was good for, I thought, was possibly taking the sun off a man's face in the later afternoon. which would be one small thing in the plus column, maybe offsetting the return of the ominous radiator leak whine, which was again threatening to do. How the pig got through the wall seemed impossible to imagine. When I saw Harry again in the mirror, my first thought, I kid you not, was that I was going to miss him. He had perfected his in and out art and paid the price, and this time was going to pass me and accelerate into the distance ahead and get to Florida before me. I would hear the horns blaring ahead into the distance, and I was never going to see him again. I did chuckle to myself that it would only be just if I were to come upon him on down the road ahead, wrecked off to the side. And I would nod knowingly and continue on. But I didn't really think that kind of judgment would be meted out so convincingly. And so when Harry cleared me and began to pass the car ahead of me, I was a little saddened and felt I was possibly missing out on a different, more exciting way of life that had never really been available to me before that time. A black and white cow ran out in front of the car in front of me and slammed into Harry's right bumper and careened him down through some sawgrass and into a ditch filled with muddy water and thorny-looking bushes, and left him there looking downwards at an angle much steeper than previously and with ditch water well above his front bumper. Unless he was being followed along by his own personal wrecking service, on call, as we would say today, I didn't see how he was going to get drug out of that one and back on the road any time soon. And so the rest of us moved on to the south. Now, why would I be telling you this story unless there was more to it? And the fact that you're already trying to name the next animal tells me you think there is some small reason to believe this story. I'll save you the trouble. It was a sheep, and I saw it coming because I was watching for it. It came through a gap in the trees like a scalded ghost, and it hit Harry's gigantic green Pierce arrow in exactly the same dent as the others. I say might, even have slowed just so slightly so as to avoid a collision with the animal myself. That sheep came across right in front of me and straight-lined it into Harry's bumper, and I knew even then it had nothing to do with me exactly. It was the two of us together, me and Harry. Harry's luck and my own much less spectacular luck were somehow intertwined. Harry could not get past me on Route 301 going south past Santee, South Carolina, and that was his last try. This time Harry was turned around back facing the highway, and at least one wheel was completely off. The front fender was off and jammed into the sand, and there was a shattered sapling pinning the back of the car down into a copse of palmetto. Harry himself was still at the wheel. He looked pretty darn discouraged. But that was it for the day for Harry. Anybody could see that. Now, in later years, I have mused a bit on what the exact connection between our two lucks, me and Harry's, could possibly have been. It is the nature of the human beast to try to figure these things out. I'm not one for celestial conspiracies. Either it's all flat luck or there's a reason. If there was a reason, then surely it had to do with my junky old Model A with its odd, high-pitched little pinhole radiator leak. That with Harry's ridiculously long-snouted Pierce Arrow V12 banging like an open coal door on a Burlington and Quincy steam engine. And of course, the horns. All these sounds together, and the heat, made those lurking farm animals go silly scared through the line of their swamp tree corral and out into the road, But needless to say, I don't really believe that. I can't really believe that, because that would imply that had the radiator wine not been acting up at the exact same time as Harry was passing, he would have just sped on by into the indiscriminate future. And I can't really believe that either. I don't even remember now if the radiator whine was blaring as Harry approached. Is it possible that the banging of Harry's engine itself provoked the whine, which in turn provoked the animals? Over 100 miles apart along an impregnable line of barricaded swamp wilderness bordered by U.S. Route 301 that one afternoon? I don't think so. Let's face it, it was luck. All that was luck. Hard luck, if you want to look at it that way. Some luck is hard. Maybe luck is just another way of saying what happened. To a man who must be known forever as, I guess there's no way around it, Hard Luck Harry. And that was the last time I saw Harry. My father's exact words were, as you may or may not have suspected, it was my father who told me the story, which is another reason I know it to be true. I spent thousands of hours with the man, and there were no lies. No fishing story was ever exaggerated. No close call in a lightning storm was ever played up for effect. I was there for those stories. Harry hit a sheep, pure and simple. Before that, he hit a pig and a cow. He may have hit ducks and buffaloes and alligators and chimpanzees before and after, and all of that may also have been true. But what he did hit for a fact was a sheep, and before that, a pig and a cow. My father's exact words were, quote, and that was the last time I ever saw or heard of Hard Luck Harry. I hope he made it to Florida, but I never knew it if he did, unquote. That's what happened one hot day in February 1935 on Route 301 south of Santee, South Carolina. Now, at the great risk of going on too long, I feel that I must end this account of Hard Luck Harry on a yet more personal note. As I say, I wasn't there, but over the years I have come to believe I kind of was there, even though I couldn't have been there and can't be there. This story is like a friend to me. If I want to go back to a previous time when, as they say, things were different, when cars were different and roads, even people, when the air was different, a time when my father was alive and young like I used to be. And occasionally I have thought previously of telling the story myself as he told it, but then I always think of how the stage actress Liza Minnelli always replied to requests for her to sing Over the Rainbow, a song made immortal by her incandescent mother, Judy Garland. Minnelli always replied, "It's been done." Ditto for Hard Luck Harry. And there's something about the story that causes me want it never to end, which it seems like it does if you tell it with a beginning and an end. It's been 20 years that my father has been gone, and another 20 before that when I last heard the story. And it seems somehow that if I try to relay the story into the future by telling it, like I am now, that the story will in fact somehow be completed, that it will be truly over. Of course, I can't have done the story justice. How could I? And I've made concrete certain details. I've memorialized them at the expense of others that should not be forgotten. And I've committed a myriad of other fractures or imperfections or glitches that slant the story wrong. And my father will now be truly gone. and a part of myself may be gone, retired, so to speak, buried, which Harry never actually was, keep in mind, during the story. Maybe this is all why I have waited so long to tell the story. But now that I've done it, at least I can tell you cheerfully that none of that turns out to be the case, because I finished my recollection of the telling of the story only a week ago. And just yesterday, I was driving slowly in the countryside like I often do, and a car passed me in a gravel scattering hurry, and like always, I eased up on the gas just a bit and kept my eyes on the brushy fence row to the right, on the theory and the feeling that there is yet another chapter to be written.